So we're looking at Roland Barthes, and with Barthes, in particular, his work, The Death of the Author. And I've mentioned that already in a previous class, but I wanted to spend a little more time on that today. Barthes, born 1915, dies 1980. Generally associated with structuralism, which is part of the confusion as a figure, because although he spent his early days trying to find a universal grammar, which he had in common with the Ferdinand de Saussure. And I should say a little bit about that, which I haven't said so far, which I think is at least interesting, and it's a side note to modern literary theory, but it's not a side note to literary theory in general. The search for an original language is not one that began in the 20th century. It probably, I'm not sure about its beginnings, but you can see it in the 16th century as well. The desire to find an Adamic language. What was the language that Adam really spoke? With the idea that Adam's original knowledge of the world would have been correct and scientific, as well as being expressive and good and all of those things, and the sense that along with the fall there was a fall of knowledge. So it's not just the man who fell and the human race that fell, but so did our understanding of the world around us, which is a very interesting and antithetical way of understanding knowledge to that the Enlightenment presents, because the Enlightenment presents the early beginnings of human life in very rudimentary forms. So I mentioned this already, the portrait of the caveman dragging the cave woman around by the hair and speaking in grunts and groans and cries expressively and so forth. And then over time, us moving away from those early emotive, expressive relations to more rational ones. So moving from the poetic age to the philosophical age, or the poetic to the religious to the philosophical, and finally to the scientific era. And there's a author by the name of Peacock in the early 19th century that talks about the 4 ages of poetry, and he argues that poetry nowadays is effectively obsolete, and that's the backdrop for Percy Bysshe Shelley's defense of poetry. And he says that, poetry has always been with us and always will be. It's a part of every age, and the way he comes at it to disprove Peacock's thesis is to say that the poet is to expand the view of what the poet is. So he includes Jesus as a poet, and Socrates as a poet, and Isaac Newton as a poet, and so forth. So there's something essential about the poet, but Percy Shelley responds to this view of poetry by just simply expanding the notion of what poetry is. Whether he's, I think when he does that, he is trying to say something important. On the other hand, he is clearly not falling in with the tram lines of what historically would have been understood as poetry. So the philosophers attack the poets, for instance. And though I have said to you that Plato is a master rhetorician and a poet himself in some ways in the way he structures his dialogues, he clearly is also writing against the poets, and he doesn't see himself as one. So Shelley's portrait of Plato as a poet is one that Plato himself would have rejected, and unless everything good is poetry, which is what basically Shelley is saying, I think his defense doesn't really hold much water. All the same, in the 16th century, there is an attempt within the modernity, however you define it here, in this sense, probably connected with modern science. And even before that, the belief that early knowledge was in some ways comprehensive. It was not affected by the fall. And so Adam, when he names the animals, he would have not just been giving them a sign, but he would have been designating the race, the thing that was being designated. And that knowledge was something that the humanists were seeking to recover. And so when you read Milton's treatise of education, he talks about the aim of education being to restore the ruins of our first parents. That's the aim. It's a recovery process, not a progress to new knowledge. It's a recovery of lost knowledge. And that aim of recovering lost knowledge, I think, is there in the scholarship of Lewis and Tolkien. And I would say for myself as well, I don't want to be original and say new things that have never been thought before. I want to hold on to everything good and true and beautiful that has ever been thought. And that's the task of the scholar. So it's fundamentally a very conservative one. You're conserving what's good rather than creating something new. And that's a good way of understanding the difference between Tolkien and Lewis within the discipline of English literature, and their insistence on learning Old English in order to understand English as it evolves, and Tolkien's own obsession with languages and the root meaning of languages, which Lewis also shares, by the way, and then the modern school of English literature, which largely regards the things in the past as having been superseded by more contemporary things. And Lewis describes that as a fallacy. And it's a fallacy that's based on the machine, more or less. You know, the newest machines are the best machines, therefore the newest knowledge is the best knowledge. He says not so. But so the 16th century sought to recover this Adamic knowledge. Well, come the 19th century, there was the same idea of a universal grammar or a universal language. And, but there it took a rather different form. It was in the postulate of an original language, which they called, at the time it was called Proto-Indo-Germanic. Which after Nazi Germany got rebranded Proto-Indo-European. It wasn't, we didn't want to be associated with the Germans on this, but they held on to the idea that there was a universal language, and beneath all, even ancient languages, there was a language, the traces of an older language, an original language, just like in the hypothesis of a source behind all the other sources in New Testament studies. There's a Q document, like the Q being the Quelle, the source for all these other accounts. And there's a master document there. In the same way, there's a master language, which underlies Sanskrit and Chinese and all the various languages. They have a common root. So if you read enough of the languages, and you see the commonalities, you will find that there's a more basic language underneath. And with that, the 19th century explodes, and scholars tend to know multiple languages, like dozens even. And Tolkien himself would have been one of those, and Lewis likewise. So not the language for their own sake, but rather for the language that lay beneath those languages. And so a great deal of interest in etymology as well. Etymology being the study of roots of words. Right? And so the search for a universal grammar is not that different than a search for a universal or original language. And but that view and search for original language, which was very much a part of Romanticism as well. So we can see in Rousseau and a German by the name of Herder, this aim to get back to the original language, and that's why they thought poetry was so important. Even in the scientific age, we need to get back to the poetic forms, because poetry is more basic than scientific discourse. scientific discourse is in some sense alienated from the roots of our identity, and hence the desire to get back to the oral languages of the natives of this country and of other countries. We know their language may actually be closer to true knowledge. So their forms of knowing, it's very popular in our day to talk about native forms of knowing, and wisdom and form and these things, and these should be acknowledged and recognized. And there's a debate and a dispute within the academy to some degree about whether this should be entertained or just rejected as absolute nonsense. But underlying it is the idea that there is a primal form of knowledge that is deeply rooted even beneath the languages. And the attempt in the 20th century to find a universal grammar, which we see in Saussure, is just an aspect of that, I think. Where it differs is that it's not now trying to find a language, it's trying to come up with a theory of language, which explains language, as I said, words in relation to words rather than words in relation to things. And that's where it falls. It differs from the other ones. It doesn't think that there's a nature to words. So the idea of cultures arising from languages. So a culture, what's the relation between a culture and a nature? Well, a culture would, in the search for Adamic language, or even in the Proto-Indo-Germanic or Proto-Indo-European, trying to recover that language, would be saying that all cultures are in some ways giving us, if we took it the composite of all these things, or even looked at the roots of all of these various languages, we would in some sense be getting closer to nature and restoring the lost knowledge of old. Whereas the structural linguistics of Ferdinand de Saussure and Roland Barthes, I think, is not so interested in recovering nature, but rather it's more in tune with progressivism. So it defines language in relation to other words. So I've talked about that repeatedly here, so I don't need to talk about that. But semiology, semiotics, the signs, a science of signs, it really is a science. So it becomes a science rather than an art. But I should say that these men who did these studies, like Barthes and Saussure and Tolkien, his generation, they knew multiple languages. They genuinely did. And they were genuinely learned individuals, whereas their contemporary practitioners usually know very few languages. And those that they do know, they butcher and come up with new words, etc. But anyway, he's a very odd sense. So back to Barthes, rather, he begins as a structuralist, and then there's a sort of a shift in the 1960s. And after that, he is very, maybe because of the radicalism of the 60s, I don't know, is very much pushing in the other direction. He arranges 3 of his books alphabetically. So one's called SZ. So as to avoid a thematic organization, or to avoid a logical organization, because he, in order to demonstrate the legitimacy of the sign as opposed to the logic, or a sign or as opposed to the theme, he wants to have it purely sign based. So he breaks it down to its quite frankly its most rudimentary component, which is just simply the sign. And it's almost the worship of the material. And the most, the way it puts it in your, this anthology here, which is quite, I think, appropriate, he says he was less a path breaker than a habit breaker, resolutely committed to unlearning the routines of intelligibility, even those he himself had helped promote. I think we'll just leave it at that. So if you find him unintelligible, that's because he sought to be unintelligible. He's committed to unintelligibility, which you would normally think was an accusation which a person would take offense at, and maybe it could be meant offensively, but if he was thoroughly committed to it as being the root and the essence of what language is, so as opposed to the logic that arises out of the word, out of the grammar, everything's going to be reduced to grammar, right? In terms of the trivium, there's the grammar, there's the logic that arises from it, and there's the rhetoric, the practice of all the rules that have been derived. But if you're going to break that down and get to its bare roots, then you're going to just get to the grammar, and behind the grammar is just simply the phonemes and the morphemes and the basic signs and so forth there. So here's the radical breaking up and what R.V. Young calls the war with the word. And the thinkers that fall in the post-structuralist, one of which, as I say, Barthes is the one we're looking at today, in common have developed terms that we now use, at least we being in the literary theory component of the academy, which we appear in common day expression. So post-structuralism, which is what we're talking about here, is not a body of work. It doesn't have it's not a coherent movement. And there is even a debate about what it is still, and how it even relates to structuralism, or even how we read Saussure. But post-structuralism is usually connected with Derrida, whom we looked at last class, and the later Barthes, of which the death of the author is probably his most famous expression. So he's that. So as I said to you, post-structuralism assumes the legitimacy of structuralism. But it distances itself from it in certain features. And then it presents a more radical attack on the orthodoxies that prevail, and structuralism is one of them, but only one of them. So even distinguishing structuralism from post-structuralism is problematic for pretty much everyone, including those within the discipline. They'll debate over that. If they're involved in the discussion at all, they will actually debate over what constitutes structuralism and what constitutes post-structuralism. And I'm trying to present it to you in a very simple form, and I can't, in part because of that. It's just, it's a big mess. But part of the post-structuralist impetus is caught up with in a work that Derrida wrote. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about Derrida briefly and then move to Barthes. One that was called of Grammatology. This is his most important work, actually. It's just too large to assign to an intro of Grammatology. And in Of Grammatology and other works, we see a shift away from the logocentrism, which marked the Western tradition, to a more radical break. So to some degree, I would say that structuralism, as it's represented by Ferdinand de Saussure, is an attempt to continue the project of logocentrism. It's just got a new theory of language, but it's going to retain the idea of human nature, and it's going to retain the sense that words convey meaning. Right? Structuralism will do those things, or at least attempt to do it. That's the aim of those that derive it. They want a universal grammar, a grammar that will comprehend all the other languages in the same way that the Proto-Indo-European language would comprehend all the later languages within it. So it's that same thing. But post-structuralism is more radical than that, and it will question how possible that even is, or even desirable it is. So the academy radicalizes itself in the 1960s. For what reasons? I mean, you can come up with theories for it. Is it the Vietnam War? Is it the sexual revolution? Is it the influence of cultural Marxists in destabilizing Western governments? Is it part of a propaganda assault from within the Western Academy, which has been encouraged by the Soviet Union and its proxies? It's not entirely clear. But there is definitely a shift that goes on in post-structuralism that is entirely radical. And one of them is that the signs are completely arbitrary. So they don't point, and I talked about here the culture-nature divide. Now they never point to nature. They're completely arbitrary. There's nothing that holds it down. The only thing that holds, so the arbitrariness of the sign. Arbitrary. And from arbitrary, we have the Latin word for the will, arbitrio. So it is entirely a consequence of what we will the word to mean. That's what it means. Now, if every individual could will a word to mean what he or she meant it to mean, it would mean that nobody understood anything. Right? We might understand our own language, although I'm not sure about that. But it would certainly be the case that other people would have no idea what we meant. And so later theorists will come up with explanations for how, even though our use of language is arbitrary and it's not grounded in nature, neither human nature nor the nature of God nor the nature of the world as it has been created, if it's none of those things, then what will hold it to have meaning? And then the answer is usually social convention. So it is arbitrary, but the society will determine the meaning of words in the future. And then the all-important issue is who controls the language. Because if the language is dependent on what we, as in the contemporary generation, determines that the words mean, then it becomes all important who is calling the shots on how words get used. And it ends up being a strange combination of the academy and the perceived lowest elements of human society, the criminal, the gang. So slang starts becoming a part of pop culture and is taken up into elite discourse. So it's no longer it remains top down, very much so, but it disguises that by using the language of the streets and the prisons. But it's still very much orchestrated by those who are holding on to the cultural levers, and those will be academics and judges and politicians, by and large. So there are arbitrary signs, but in addition to arbitrary words, which are decided, the sense of meaning to them is ascribed by the group, and hence the importance of political correctness, by the way. You have to agree to accept the meaning that we say words mean, because otherwise you'll offend somebody, and they can't be offended. So although it's arbitrary and there's no fixed meaning, they insist that it is fixed, because if it weren't fixed, then you could say it means this and they could say it means that. And then there would be simply discord. And since all language, according to them, is not tied to nature but simply to usage, we have to prohibit certain speech acts from occurring. And most of those are references to things like sex. So you'll notice in our culture, the word sex has almost disappeared from usage, and we use the word gender instead. So sex refers to the act, the sexual act, but it doesn't refer to a person's nature. If you look on your birth certificate, it will say sex, and then it will be an M or an F. In gender identity theories, those are constructs imposed upon us at birth. which sounds at first blush crazy, and it may be crazy, but it is entirely in keeping with all language being arbitrary and socially derived conventions about what words even mean. So, right? So that was an arbitrary and oppressive imposition of a word, a defining word on a person, and the person doesn't identify with those binary categories, right? So you can see it's tied in with that view of language. All language works this way, they say. Now, in order for that to succeed, by the way, they have to kill the humanities. Because the humanities of the sort that Tolkien and Lewis hold on to, and Christians hold on to furthermore, by the way, will say that there is a nature to nature, that there is not only a reality but an ultimate reality. That whole idea has to go. It cannot be allowed to prevail in the academy. It has to be drowned out, it has to be marginalized, it has to be excluded. It has to be criminalized. Because it is at odds with the idea that we can control reality through our speech. Socially. Can't be permitted. There's no dissent. Now, this is the irony of the 1960s movement, is the protest movement against the authorities, which is itself not only authoritarian, but so authoritarian that it permits no dissent, and particularly on ultimate matters. And it expresses itself in the form of speech and speech codes. Comments or questions about that? Does that ring true to you at all? You can see the way in which post-structuralism operates is entirely in keeping with this view of language. So it begins, as I say, with a view of language which is connected with the humanistic project of knowledge. But eventually, once it radicalizes, it is despairing of that view, and eventually it just simply says, as Michel Foucault will eventually say, famously, knowledge is power. And he almost means that literally. Knowledge is power. And he's talking about the structures that determine what words mean. And so if we can name things and determine you have to use this term and not that term, you have power. And if your terms are denied, you have no power. You have no identity. So the academy becomes intensely colonized by radicals. And they now rule the roost in the academy, I would say. Originally in Saussure, and probably in the early Barthes, language is connected with intentionality. So what I mean by this, and so when I want to understand what an author means, even if I use Saussure's semiotic system, I will still be trying to recover what the author intended by it. So when you read a text by Shakespeare, you can use Saussure's semiotic analysis of this using his binary oppositions and so forth. And what you're still seeking to recover, though, is the intention of the author. What did Shakespeare mean when he wrote Macbeth? What was the intention of the author? Well, we can break it down that way. But as the time progresses, the arbitrary nature of language breaks down the arbitrary, that is the will of Shakespeare in writing those words, and then it becomes arbitrary in the sense of having no agency at all. Like it's totally arbitrary. It's not just what Shakespeare willed through writing Macbeth. It's what we will by reading Macbeth. Now, by the way, in the new Critics about which some of you wrote your essays, they talked about these in terms of fallacies. The intentional fallacy is that we can recover what the author intended. I think it's Wimsatt in Beardsley which wrote on the intentional fallacy. I'm quite sure. These are the new critics. They spoke of the intentional fallacy. What does the author intend by this? And they argue that we can't know what he intended, we can know what he wrote. And the only access we have to the intention of the author is the words on the page. Right? So we can't get to the spirit of the author. They're attacking Romanticism, by the way. We can't really get to it, the spirit, what the author intended by any means other than the words that are written there. So let's stick with that. They call that the intentional fallacy. On the other hand, there's another fallacy that they also want to flag up. They call this the effective fallacy, which is what do I think about what the author wrote? Its effect on me, how I feel about it. They say this is also a fallacious way of reading a text. That's not the question you should ask. You shouldn't ask what the author intended. You should not ask how I feel about the text. These are wrong questions to ask. Ask what the words on the page mean. Let's try and cut out not just the romantic expressivist paradigm, but let's cut out the social contextualization of all things, so we end up getting away from the text and always talking about the context. And we're part of the context. But these two fallacies are ones that the new critics point out. And they're at both ends. It's the author's intentions and the reader's intentions. The new critics call both of these fallacies. But I would say in spite of that fact, there remains deeply embedded within the academy an attempt to recover authorial intention at any rate. But one of the forms of the effective fallacy is called reader response theory, by the way. So in biblical criticism. So yes, this is what, even if they say, yes, this is what Jesus meant, or this is what Paul meant, or what John meant, or whoever the author, or this is what Moses meant, the question is, because of the work of the Spirit of God, what do we think the text means now? Because do we not have the Spirit? Paul had the Spirit, but the Spirit is living and active, and therefore the meaning of the word can change. And yes, he meant that, but then you contextualize Paul and say, but he was a Palestinian Jew writing in the, 1st century AD, and he had a very different context than we do. So he may have meant that, but that's not how I believe the text to operate now. And that will, in legal documents, that will be called the living tree view of interpretation. And against that is originalism. So in the United States, there's this debate in the legal academy between those who want to go to the original intention of the authors of the Constitution. And the way they will demonstrate that is not by reading their biographies or reading their letters. They will simply look at the text, the Constitution itself, and they'll stick to the meaning of those words. At the time when they were written, here's what was meant. As opposed to those who are not so interested in the original meaning of the words, but rather are trying to read it in a way that will take account of the world as it has changed since that time. I think both sides have a point, by the way. On the other hand, I'm with the originalists, because if there is no original meaning to the text, then there is no governing principles or documents behind the whole body politic. Right? If this is the foundational document that defines the people, then you have to attribute to it a sort of meaning that will give an identity. Or you're going to do what the progressives want to do with the Constitution, which is to say it's insignificant because the society that we want to create is at odds with the society that existed at the time. And since they further view that language actually works that way anyway, there is no real nature to God, ourselves, the world around us, they are almost adamantly intent on destroying any sense of authority to the word. Anyway, Roland Barthes' essay, The Death and the Return of the Author, I chose because it's short and it's accessible, and it introduces many of the preoccupations of all the post-structuralists. And it's notorious for its stance against the Romantic and the humanist traditions. Now, so this is interesting. So I said in the search for Adamic language of the 16th and 17th centuries, which you can see there, they're wanting to get back to the language before the fragmentation of language that happened in the Tower of Babel. Because that's what happened, right? The God confused after Noah's flood, the languages, the Tower of Babel rose up, and God confused the languages and spread them throughout the earth. So they're trying to get to a pre-Babylonian form of discourse. If you're interested in the topic, have a look at George Steiner. He's an interesting humanist scholar. Now, passed away, but operated from Switzerland for many years. But I think he wrote a series of essays after Babel. It's very readable. So the humanist, and these are Christian humanists, were very interested in that, but so were the Romantics. So here's the common ground. The Romantics were also interested in this sort of language, and the reason that they did so is because they were interested in their own expression and thought that there was truth in it. So in some ways, the Romantics are a continuation of the humanist project. They just put, rather than the word of God being the central thing, it's the word of the poet as the substitute for it. So poets then take on a divine, expressive role, and the poets are then the leaders of their culture. This is what they, if you read the Romantic poets, it's abundantly clear that they have a very high view of what they do. In fact, they even call themselves creators, which they certainly would not have done in the 16th century. And rather than mimesis, which is the art of imitating reality or representing reality as it has already been given, they move more towards expressiveness and originality. But not in the sense of going back to an origin and recovering it, but rather originality in the sense that we use the word now, in the sense of novelty. Entirely new. Fits with progressivism. But still, both the humanist and the Romantic tradition ascribe value to the author. The author is the whole center of the linguistic project in both cases. So there's a center still. It's just that the human author replaces God's divine authorship. But now, in Roland Barthes, that is also under assault. So both the Romantics and the Christian humanists are being targeted here. And I would also say they're being equated as if there were no difference between them. And in my lit theory course, I've suggested there's a radical difference between them. But not for the post-structuralists. They see them as one and the same. And so the Christian humanists who are building on the classical age and see some sort of a continuity to it, which you can, if you just read Tolkien and Lewis on the subject, they see themselves as, although very different than the classical age, still recognizing the Tao and other categories of understanding as legitimate and to this very day, whereas their contemporaries act as if there were no Tao, and as if there were no nature, and as if they could break free from nature and they could condition everything. And in the Lewis course that I was teaching, I suggested that there was a contemporary psychologist, contemporary at the time, who, what was his name? Drawing the blank. The behaviorist psychologist who identifies Lewis as representing the literatures of freedom and dignity. B.F. Skinner. Yeah, behaviorist, famous psychologist. And he really sees the divide in the same way, and B.F. Skinner is writing right around this time as well. And I think that the behaviorist psychological project is of a piece with exactly what's going on in the 1960s as well. So it's pure materialism. And materialism, of course, if you hold to it consistently, well, then you can't operate at all because you can't think materially. But never mind. But your view of language is effectively, it's a material substrate of the play of words, more or less. So it's just words on the page. And I think you can see that in Roland Barthes in the sense that he organizes things alphabetically rather than logically. As the grammar as opposed to logic. So he's going down in some sense to the root of the thing. But in another sense, it's as if the man were insane. But he proclaims the death of the author. Now, that proclaimed death of the author, I said to you a few classes ago, sounds a lot like what Nietzsche said in the 19th century. He said, God is dead. And we have killed him furthermore. And if you hear Christian apologists and so forth, they like to say, yes, but Nietzsche is dead. And they get a laugh from the audience. And they, okay, fine. But that's not what he's saying, right? He's talking about an intellectual movement which didn't need the author anymore, or didn't need divine authority, because he was asserting that he was the divine authority. He was a romantic prophet of sorts, right? Just like the Romantics. They also proclaimed the death of God. The death of God did not begin with Friedrich Nietzsche, by the way. It began in the early 19th century, maybe even a little bit earlier than that. It's a description of a whole movement of the Romantics in which they replace God. But here it goes more radically than that, and he says that the author himself does not exist. So we don't need to hold to the authority of what even Mr. Saussure had to say. Because that ascribes to, and he could even use the language of the new critics that he so adamantly would have opposed, their idea of the intentional fallacy and the effective fallacy. He says, yes, that's true. We have no access to that. All we have access to are the words on the page. And the words on the page don't hold together logically. They hold together in terms of words relating to other words. But that's not a logic, let alone a theme. So let me read some of this. Comments or questions about that? I've taken a fair bit of class time, but it's yes.
So does he reject the use of logic? Like, just to make an argument, you would need logic to have that function.
Yeah, you do, and so this is the case with all of even the most radical of writers, is that they admit this as well, that they have to use it because they usually say something along the lines of, well, provisionally I have to do this now, but eventually I won't. Which is ridiculous. Why would that be? Well, they need to say that. Because if they said that we will always use it, they would acknowledge that there was a substructure which was a necessity for understanding the world, and they've just disputed that. So they admit that they're using a logic to make their case, but they say that it's only because we're not able to understand them that they're having to do this. So we have to use the form of understanding to convey understanding, but that's because the rest of us are too stupid to follow the thoughts. So we're going to use understanding for now, but eventually we can get over all that. I mean, maybe I'm being unfair, but I don't think I'm being unfair. This is more or less what is stated by all the radical authors, is they will acknowledge that they're sawing off the branch they're standing upon, while standing upon it at the same time and having to stand on it to make their case. I have to assume that you can convey meaning, and I'm going to use an argument of sorts to present it. Now, on the other hand, there are ways of presenting that you are even undermining that, and as I say, the way in which he constructs his books is one way of signing that, if you will. As I say, alphabetically organizing it rather than logically organizing it, or thematically or rhetorically organizing it. So I see it as and this was the critique of the philosophers of Derrida, and the Anglo-American Academy by and large said this is a bunch of nonsense. And rather than engaging with it, we should just regard you as illegitimate imposters and not have anything to do with you. But as I say, even Derrida, who is the most significant of them in some ways, although not nearly as significant as Michel Foucault turned out to be, they insinuated themselves into the most elite institutions and practiced there for decades. Because the elite institutions were taken over by people with Marxist sympathies. They probably had them, and they liked the new French approach. I don't think I'm just operating on an anti-French bias here. The irony about the fact that it comes out of France is that France is associated with rationality. Like, this is the country that most identifies with reason. They had a goddess of reason in the French Revolution, right? But there it's a reason in which God has been resolutely attacked and sought to be removed from the very structure of their society. But the death of the author, well, let's have a look at it here. And it really is, we only have a little snippet of it. We've got 4 pages, really. So I'm going to read just some of it and try and make a few comments on it. And he's referring to French authors, Balzac, and I don't even know if you've read Balzac yourselves, and most of us have not. So we'll just go with it, and we'll try and comment anyway. In his story Sarrasine, Balzac, describing a castrato disguised as a woman, writes the following sentence. Let me stop for a second. Do you know what a castrato is? No? Castratos were singers, first of all, and they were male singers, and they were male singers that were castrated before they hit puberty, at which point their voice changes, right? It deepens through because of testosterone and so forth. But if you castrate before they get to that, then the sound which a male voice makes pre-puberty will be retained. And so men were gelded in the Renaissance period, no, really the Enlightenment period, in order to retain that beautiful sound. And there are famous castrati. It's a horrid practice, obviously. But describing a castrato disguised as a woman, writes the following sentence. This was woman herself, with her sudden fears, her irrational whims, her instinctive worries, her impetuous boldness, her fussings, and her delicious sensibility. Now, this is Balzac describing women. Note that the description of woman fits the mold that I talked about last time, that Burke had left us with this paradigm of the beautiful, irrational, sensible, etc. That's the woman. And of course, here the woman is a castrato, so it's not even a woman, but nonetheless. Anyway, back to the text. Here's Barthes' question. Who is speaking thus? Is it the hero of the story bent on remaining ignorant of the castrato hidden beneath the woman? Is it Balzac, the individual, furnished by his personal experience with a philosophy of woman? Is it Balzac, the author, professing literary ideas on femininity? Is it universal wisdom, romantic psychology? We shall never know, for the good reason that writing is the destruction of every voice, of every point of origin. Writing is that neutral, composite, oblique space where our subject slips away, the negative where all identity is lost, starting with the very identity of the body writing. So note that he is talking to some extent when you read the Psalms. You're wondering who's speaking. Sometimes there's a polyphony of voices. This is one of the terms that is much beloved of this school, by the way, is polyphony. There are many voices. And whose voice is actually speaking? In the Psalms, is it God's voice? Is it the psalmist's voice? Is it another voice? In writing, you can often, many authors will insist that when they're writing an opinion, they're not writing their opinion, they're writing the narrator's opinion, but that's not their own. They might sometimes share the opinion of the narrator, but it isn't necessarily. It's a voice that they use to tell the story. And so Shakespeare, for instance, when he writes and provides different characters, note that he doesn't give us a narration per se, which one represents Shakespeare? So Balzac here, or rather Barthes, is bringing us to question here when Balzac said, "This was woman herself with her sudden fears, her irrational whims, her instinctive worries, her impetuous boldness, her fussings, and her delicious sensibilities." Is it the hero of the story who makes this judgment? Is it Balzac, the man? Is it the persona that Balzac uses to write this? Is it a different figure? Who is this voice? What does he represent? And his opening gambit here is that we have no idea of who the narrator is here, even who his identity is. And all we have is the writing. So he sounds like a new critic. Remember we looked at the new critics with R.V. Young, and they're insistent of the words on the page. No doubt, says Barthes, it has always been that way. As soon as a fact is narrated, no longer with a view to acting directly on reality, but intransitively, that is to say, finally, outside of any function other than that of the very practice of the symbol itself, this disconnection occurs. The voice loses its origin. The author enters into his own death. Writing begins. Now remember what we said last time about Derrida, about the difference between the voice and writing. Right? We talked about that? No. At that point, writing begins, when the voice loses its hold. The sense of this phenomenon, however, has varied. In ethnographic studies, the responsibility for a narrative is never assumed by a person, but by a mediator, a shaman, or relator whose performance, the mastery of the narrative code, may possibly be admired, but never his genius. So he's not the originator of this. He's just passing it on. He's a medium, as if he were embodied by the spiritual world. The author, as we note, is a modern figure, a product of our society insofar as emerging from the Middle Ages with English empiricism, French rationalism, and the personal faith of the Reformation, it discovered the prestige of the individual, of, as it is more nobly put, quote, the human person. So he agrees, by the way, with what I said about Harold Bloom, that Shakespeare is the inventor of the human. The idea of the human person is connected with modernity, which I think is just patently false. The doctrine of the human person is a theological consequence of the thought that we're made in the Imago Dei. It arises in the discussions of the three persons of the Trinity and the Church Fathers as an implication of that. If God is in his nature to be a person, the divine person, and there are three persons in the unity of the Godhead, and we are in the Imago Dei, then we also have personhood. But in the literary theories of the 20th century, they will latch on to this view that Barthes is representing here, that the idea of personhood is a fiction, a postulate of modernity. And then they will undermine and seek to demonstrate that such personhood is not true of our personhood. In fact, we have no personhood. That's a fiction. And that's precisely what he's doing here. So now we've moved away from deconstructing text to deconstructing persons. This is a key moment. And we live in that moment, by the way, which is why sexual identity is no longer normative. Right? That's a natural distinction. But we want a cultural one, a sociological one, like gender. The beauty of gender, by the way, is that it has no relation to sex at all. None. There's no connection. It's totally arbitrary, and that's the point. The rationalist like Jordan Peterson objects, says it's totally irrational. And I say, that's the point. That's why it's used. It's used because it is totally irrational. It is totally arbitrary. That's the truth of it. It's also the problem with it. But he says that it is the human person that emerges from the author and the author with that. So authorship is a modern figure, and so is the human person. This is also false. The idea of authorship is there in the ancient world. It's not just the human person. The idea of the author is also there in the ancient world. And what I would say Barthes does here is he does a very illegitimate and if not false representation of the whole of the Western tradition. He de-Christianizes, Christian irrelevant, and also he seems to discount the classical heritage as well, and it's all in the form of the modern. So it's part of the querelle des modernes of the classics and the moderns. So, but I'll go on. It is thus logical, if the human person is a modern invention, a modern figure, that in literature it should be this positivism, that is the positivism that says that there's a human person, the epitome and culmination of capitalist ideology, which has attached the greatest importance to the, quote, person, unquote, of the author. The author still reigns in histories of literature, biographies of writers, interviews, magazines, as in the very consciousness of men of letters anxious to unite their person and their work through diaries and memoirs. The image of literature to be found in ordinary culture is tyrannically centered on the author, his person, his life, his tastes, his passions, while criticism still consists for the most part in saying that Baudelaire's work is the failure of Baudelaire the man, Van Gogh's his madness, Tchaikovsky's his vice. The explanation of a work is always sought in the man or woman who produced it, as if it were always, in the end, through the more or less transparent allegory of the fiction, the voice of a single person, the author confiding in us. Though the sway of the author remains powerful, and then he puts in brackets, the new criticism has often done no more than consolidate it. It goes without saying that certain writers have long since attempted to loosen it. In France, Mallarmé was doubtless the first to see and to foresee in its full extent the necessity to substitute language itself for the person, who until then had been supposed to be its owner. So it follows the New Critic's postulate, but it takes it to a different purpose. In the New Critic's rendering, the authority of the author would be understood through the text, but the author remained. They insisted on a strategy of reading which is not going to consider the author's psychology or expression. He's just going to look at the words on the page. He's not going to consider how the audience feels about the text. They're just going to look at the words on the page. But this takes it in a different direction. We're not going to look at consider the person who wrote this text at all. In fact, we're going to say that there is no such person. All we have is language. For him, for us too, it is language which speaks, not the author. Now, this sounds a lot like Martin Heidegger. The text reveals itself to us, not the author reveals himself to us through the text, but the text which speaks, the language which speaks, not the author. To write is, through a prerequisite impersonality, not at all to be confused with the castrating objectivity of the realist novelist, to reach that point where only language acts, performs, and not me. Mallarmé's entire poetics consists in suppressing the author in the interest of writing, which is, as will be seen, to restore the place of the reader. Valéry encumbered by a psychology of the ego, considered diluted Mallarmé's theory, but his taste for classicism leading him to turn to the lessons of rhetoric, he never stopped calling into question and deriding the author. He stressed the linguistic and, as it were, hazardous nature of his activity, and through his prose works he militated in favor of the essentially verbal condition of literature, in the face of which all recourse to the author's interiority seemed to him pure superstition. I'll skip over some of the other reference to French authorship, and I'll skip down to about 9 lines below the bottom. Leaving aside literature itself, such distinctions really becoming invalid. Linguistics has recently provided the destruction of the author with a valuable analytical tool by showing that the whole of the enunciation is an empty process, functioning perfectly without there being any need for it to be filled with the person of the interlocutors. Linguistically, the author is never more than the instance writing. Not the person writing, the instance writing. Just as I is nothing other than the instance saying I. Language knows a subject, not a person. So we might know the subject. Who's the subject of the sentence? It's that pronoun that we use as I. You can give it a name as well, but that's the subject of the sentence. It's not the person of the sentence. He's saying that grammatically speaking, the subject of the sentence is not the same as the person of the sentence. We require the notion of a subject, a verb, and an object in order to construct a sentence, but we don't require the postulate of a person behind that subject. All we require is the grammatical thing. And the idea of the person who wrote this and who is the subject of that sentence is not only unnecessary, we can't know that person. So this subject, empty outside of the very enunciation which defined it, suffices to make language hold together, suffices, that is, to say, to exhaust it. The removal of the author, one could talk here with Brecht, the German dramatist, who's, if you've ever seen Brechtian theater, he creates something called, and it says this in the footnote as well, he calls it epic theater, and the purpose of the theater is to distance and alienate the audience from traditional theatrical illusion, the idea that you're inhabiting the world of the what's going on the stage. So it's as if you were not there at all. Right? You sit there quietly in the dark, the light's on stage, there are actors speaking, and it's as if you weren't there. They don't acknowledge that you're there. Well, Brecht breaks through the fourth wall, and he will directly speak to the audience. And so that the illusion that you're watching life happen on the stage is broken by Brecht and his theaters repeatedly. Right? So it's including the audience. There isn't a performance going on, or rather you're a part of the performance. And so you can't separate the spectacle from the watching of the spectacle from the performers of the spectacle. So that's what he's referring to here. So the removal of the author, one could talk here with Brecht of a veritable distancing. The author diminishing like a figurine at the far end of the literary stage is not merely an historical fact or an act of writing. It utterly transforms the modern text. Or, which is to say the same thing, the text is henceforth made and read in such a way that at all its levels, the author is absent. The temporality is different. The author, when believed in, is always conceived of as the past of his own book. Book and author stand automatically on a single line divided into a before and an after. So before we have a man, William Shakespeare, after we have the book. But it's not Shakespeare's book. There's a Shakespeare, then there's the play. There's a before and an after. But the author is thought to nourish the book, which is to say that he exists before it, thinks, suffers, lives for it, in the same relation of antecedents to his work as a father to his child. In complete contrast, the modern scriptor, no, he doesn't use the author, he's trying to find an alternative. The modern scriptor is born simultaneously with the text, is in no way equipped with a being preceding or exceeding the writing, is not the subject with the book as predicate. There is no other time than that of the Annunciation, and every text is eternally written here and now. The fact is, or it follows, that writing can no longer designate an operation of recording, notation, representation, depiction, as the classics would say, representation, the mimesis, depiction. Rather, it designates exactly what linguists, referring to Oxford philosophy, call a performative, a rare verbal form exclusively given in the first person and in the present tense, in which the enunciation has no other content, contains no other proposition than the act by which it is uttered, something like the I declare of kings, or the I sing of very ancient poets, like Virgil, of arms and a man I sing. Having buried the author, the modern scriptor can thus no longer believe, as according to the pathetic view of his predecessors, that this hand is too slow for his thought or passion, and that consequently, making a law of necessity, he must empathize with his delay and indefinitely polish his form. For him, on the contrary, the hand, cut off from any voice, borne by a pure gesture of inscription and not of expression, traces a field without origin, or which at least has no other origin than language itself, language which ceaselessly calls into question all origins. Okay. I think you have a sense of the thrust of it, at any rate. So he's now resolutely turning on the idea of of personhood as a fiction. And it's a fiction of which there's no substance, there's no proof of it. So he's using the new critical methodology against itself, I would say. So yes, we can't know what the intent of the author is. We can't know, nor ought we consider the effect on the audience. All we know is what's on the page, and the page is the only thing that exists, and the words on the page, and the relation of the words to one another on the page. And this constitutes not only the death of the author, it's the death of the person. So I see these, and have long seen these, as a way of the heresies of our day are primarily not theological in nature, but anthropological in nature. So they don't attack God directly, they attack the one who bears his image directly. It's not only of concern to Christians, it's of concern to all humanity, because all humanity bears the consequences of the goodness wrought by Trinitarian doctrine of the personhood and the sanctity of the person, the human person, and so forth. So it's interesting to me, and I don't think it's incidental, that the abortion movement takes on legs in the 1960s when the idea of a person connected with humanity is being disputed in the academy. It's not incidental. You've just killed a clump of cells or whatever. I mean, everybody understands that even if you called it a clump of cells, the clump of cells of its own telos becomes a fully formed human being. Or it doesn't, for whatever reason. There's a defect, and the pregnancies doesn't come fully to term for whatever, but left to its own devices and with all normal conditions there, a child is born at the outset of that. But if you attack the idea of human personhood and you simply have the author, then we have fictional identities. Identities which can be ascribed by words. And they exist only in words and not outside the words. On the page, by the way, the written word. And then the written text has a determination over human nature, which it never had before, because before that, the written text would only point to the authority of the author of the originator of the text, which was God, or those to whom he spoke, namely people. The text itself has no authority outside of the person who inspired the text and who read the text, right? The text is not, it's just the instrumental thing. If you think in terms of the Aristotelian causality, you have to get all of these, but these are reducing, I think I said this last semester, modern literary theory will never look at the first cause, the original, or the initial, no, what do we call the first cause? What is the first cause in Aristotle? Is it the formal cause? No, it's the formal, the instrumental. What's the first cause and the fourth cause?
What is the final cause?
I guess it's just the final. I mean, it's sometimes called different things than that. What's the first cause? It's embarrassing. It's not just embarrassing for me now. It's I've spread the embarrassment to you because you also ought to know it. I don't want to say it's the initial cause, but it is something like that. Is it the original? It's the initial cause? I don't know. You can find it on Wikipedia. The material? No, it's not the material. The material is the form. There, he's looking at language itself, and language is just the instrument for the person or the author, and the words are the form of that instrument. So these are different ways of looking at those two things. But it neither looks at the author nor the audience, nor the intent of the author in writing the text. It just says it's only these two things. And it's as if words were just simply detached from persons. But again, if you have a robust understanding of human persons, you understand that Jesus, being the Word of God, is also the person of God. And he also is God's message to people, right? And he also speaks to them. And so all of those things are being jettisoned here in terms of the purely material things. So it's a form of, really bizarre form of materialism. And you might talk about the instrument, but really it's very radically attacking these things. And now it's not only attacking authority, it's attacking human personhood. And that is what I find most alarming. And if that's going to be the case, then postmodern literary theories following this will also be picking away at some of the carrion caused by the death of the author. And the carrion is the bodies of those who had it. So sexual identity will give way to gender identity and so forth. The politics of sexual identity, like the gay rights movement and so forth, is not the same thing as the gender identity postulate. It's a very different thing. Gender identity is an arbitrary postulate that arises purely out of the academy. Purely out of the academy. And even its existence is a fiction. But what the fiction demonstrates is how much people believe that words determine other words. So if we accept gender identity, we accept that all language works that way. It's not just in this case, but in every case. Otherwise, it makes no sense. And I hear amongst conservative and sometimes reactionary commentators, but this is ridiculous. It's just for a small minority of groups, so why are we giving ground on this? And sure, we can acknowledge this, but you don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. But that's the point. The postulate of gender identity is a concession that language already operates that way. The reason ground is being given is precisely because that's the view of language they already hold. And this just demonstrates it. I think it's infinitely problematic, and it's not infinitely problematic for Christians. It's infinitely problematic for everyone who wants to hold to there being a human nature. That is not going to be arbitrarily determined by the people in power, whoever they are. So I don't even see it as a human academic problem, it's actually demonic. This is the doctrine of demons, because it is thoroughly trying. Its only purpose is destructive, even for the people that it purports to help and represent. I don't think that actually even is the case. So anyway, I think I'll leave it off with that, in part because I've run out of time. No, I will leave it off with that.